The wind was a blade, sharp and unforgiving, whipping dust into their faces and tearing at the thin fabric of their dresses. The sun beat down with brutal indifference, bleaching the scrubland to a parched, brittle gold. 3 women huddled together beneath the meager shadow of a rock outcrop, their faces gaunt, eyes wide with a fear that tasted like ash. They were miles from anywhere, left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the bitter knowledge of their shared failure. Alara, Maeve and Cora, cast off, barren, like dried-up wells, no longer useful, abandoned by the man who had called them wives. Shame was a physical weight, pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe in the thin, hot air. Alara hugged her knees, her gaze fixed on the shimmering heat haze distorting the horizon. Each shimmer seemed to mock their desperation, their dwindling hope. Days blurred into a nightmare of thirst and hunger. They spoke little, the silence between them thick with unspoken accusations and shared despair. Maeve wept quietly at night, her sobs swallowed by the vast emptiness. Cora sat stoically, her gaze fixed and distant, as if her spirit had already left her body. Alara felt a knot of cold dread tightening in her stomach. She was the youngest, perhaps the least prepared for this stark reality, yet a flicker of stubbornness, a tiny spark of refusal to simply lie down and die, ignited deep within her. It was a fragile thing, easily extinguished by the harshness of their situation. But it was there. Then, a shape on the horizon. A rider. Fear, sharp and visceral, seized them. Who would be out here? Their former husband? Or worse? They scrambled further into the shadow, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. The rider approached slowly, deliberately, not galloping like a man in pursuit or a bandit. This man moved with a quiet confidence that spoke of purpose, of belonging to this land, however desolate. As he drew closer, the dust settled enough for them to see. A lone rider on a magnificent horse, not the flashy, cruel style of their former husbands' men. This man was large, broad-shouldered, dressed in practical, worn leather and denim. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but they could see the glint of his eyes as he paused, his gaze sweeping over their pathetic huddle. He didn't dismount immediately. He just watched them, his posture neither threatening nor welcoming. It was an assessment, clinical yet not devoid of something Alara couldn't name. Authority, perhaps, or simply patience. He was Silas Blackwood. They didn't know his name then, just that he seemed to own the very air they breathed in this remote corner of the world. He was a man of legend in the sparse settlements, the millionaire cowboy, who had somehow built an empire of land and cattle out of sheer will and isolation. A man who preferred the company of his horses and the silence of the plains to the society of men. His presence here, seeing them in their shame and ruin, felt like another layer of their degradation. He remained on his horse for what felt like an eternity, the only sound the soft shuffling of his mount and the relentless wind. Alara met his gaze, a defiant, desperate flicker in her eyes despite the trembling in her limbs. She would not look away. She would not beg. Not yet. His gaze was unreadable. Not pity, certainly. Something cooler, more analytical. Then slowly he dismounted. The movement was fluid, unhurried. He was even larger on the ground, a solid, imposing figure against the vast sky. He took a few steps towards them, stopping at a respectful distance. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep, quiet, and held the low rumble of the land itself. "You ladies lost." The question hung in the air, simple yet loaded with the weight of their reality. Lost didn't begin to cover it. Abandoned, discarded, ruined. Lost implied there was a path to find, a destination. They had none. Alara found her voice, a dry, rasping sound. "We have nowhere to go." His eyes, she could see them now, were a clear, startling blue beneath the brim of his hat. They held no judgment, only a quiet, steady observation. He looked from Alara to Maeve, huddled and weeping, then to Cora, staring blankly ahead. He understood instantly. Alara realized. The state they were in, the isolation, the fear, he saw it all. He didn't need details, didn't ask their names or their story. His focus returned to Alara, perhaps because she had spoken, perhaps because she was the one not consumed by tears or emptiness. "This is Blackwood land," he stated. "Not a threat, but a simple fact of ownership. Ain't much out here but rock and sun." He paused, considering. The silence stretched, taut with their fear and his inscrutable presence. He wasn't offering help, not yet. He was stating the conditions of their existence on the edge of his world. It felt less like finding a rescuer and more like being found by the wilderness personified. He didn't offer them water or food that first day. He simply sat some distance away, cross-legged on the ground, watching them. Like an animal observing smaller creatures it hadn't yet decided were prey or harmless. Alara watched him back, her initial fear slowly morphing into a wary curiosity. He wasn't cruel, not in the overt, sneering way their former husband had been. He was simply present, a force of nature, as stoic and immovable as the rock behind them. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal oranges and purples, he rose. He didn't speak, just walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode away the way he came, leaving them alone again, but changed by his silent acknowledgement of their existence. Had he simply decided they weren't his problem? Or was there something else in his measured departure? Alara felt a flicker of something new alongside the fear, a tiny, fragile question mark of possibility. His silent presence had been less terrifying than the complete absence they had faced before. He knew they were there now. The thought was both frightening and, inexplicably, a minuscule comfort. The night that followed was cold, the wind biting harder. But Alara didn't feel quite as utterly alone as she had the night before. A strange, imposing figure occupied the landscape of her mind now, alongside the emptiness. The next morning he returned. This time he brought water. Not much, just enough to wet their cracked lips and ease the rasp in their throats. He set the canteens down a short distance away and retreated, giving them space. They fell upon the water with desperate gratitude, gulping it down until the nausea set in. Still, he didn't speak, didn't ask. He watched as they drank, his gaze steady. Alara met his eyes over the rim of the canteen. This time, she saw something flicker there, a hint of acknowledgement, maybe even a grudging respect. He didn't seem to pity them. He seemed to be waiting. Waiting for what? For them to reveal some strength? For them to simply vanish? She didn't know. But the water was real. The relief was real. And his quiet presence felt less like a threat and more like a strange, unsettling anchor in the vast, turbulent sea of their abandonment. He stayed for an hour or so, just observing, then mounted his horse and rode away again. This pattern continued for several days. Water in the morning, sometimes a little dried meat or hardtack biscuits left at a distance. He never approached too closely, never stayed long, never spoke beyond a few necessary words like, eat, or drink. Slowly, tentatively, the women began to stir from their despair. The fear of his presence lessened, replaced by a dependence they hadn't anticipated. He wasn't a rescuer in the stories. He was a provider of bare necessities, a silent, watchful guardian. Alara, in particular, began to observe him more closely. She watched how he moved with economy and strength, how he handled his horse with quiet command, not force, how he scanned the horizon with an awareness of everything around him. He belonged here. This harsh, unforgiving land was his. And perhaps, by extension, his silent provision meant they were, for now, under its strange, harsh protection. The initial terror she'd felt in his presence began to dissipate, replaced by a wary respect. He saw their vulnerability, their ruin, yet he offered sustenance without demanding explanation or extracting a price beyond their sheer, exposed existence. It was a different kind of power than she had known, quiet, solid, rooted in the land itself. He represented stability in a world that had just proven how fragile and unstable it was. One afternoon, a dust storm began to gather on the horizon, a monstrous, churning wall of orange. The air grew thick and heavy, static electricity prickling on their skin. Panic flared in Maeve and Cora. They had nowhere to shelter from its fury. Just the rock face which would offer little protection. Silas was there, as usual a silent sentinel. He saw the storm coming. This time he didn't hesitate. He rode towards them, stopping closer than he ever had before. "My place," he said, his voice low, urgent, and utterly without room for argument. "Not far. You come with me." The offer was stark, necessary. It wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was a practical decision in the face of imminent danger. But to them it was a lifeline. Maeve and Cora looked terrified, hesitant. Alara, however, felt a surge of something else. Decision. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking the hand offered, however reluctantly. She stood, her legs shaky, and met his gaze. "We will come," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. Silas nodded, a single, decisive movement. He didn't offer them a ride on his horse. That would have been impractical for three. He simply turned and began riding at a steady pace towards the direction he'd indicated, trusting they would follow. It was a test, Alara realized. A test of their will, their resilience, their willingness to trust the strange, silent man who had appeared in their desolation. They stumbled after him, the wind beginning to lash at them, the dust stinging their eyes, following the man who had offered them not salvation, but simply shelter from the storm. They reached his homestead just as the full force of the dust storm hit. It was a collection of sturdy, low-slung buildings, built into the landscape as if they had grown there. A main house, barn, corrals. Solid, practical, built for endurance. Silas led them into the house. A surprisingly clean and ordered space, sparse but functional. He showed them where to wash up, gave them clean, if rough, blankets, and indicated a corner of the main room where they could rest. He didn't fuss over them, didn't ask questions about their past. He simply let them be, offering refuge without demanding intimacy. As the storm raged outside, rattling the window panes and howling down the chimney, Alara watched him. He moved about his house with quiet purpose, tending to his lamps, securing the shutters. There was a deep solitude about him, a man entirely comfortable in his own company and the silence of his home. Yet he had brought them in. 3 women, strangers, carrying the mark of misfortune and the shame of being unwanted. Living under Silas Blackwood's roof was a study in quiet observation and unspoken rules. He provided food, simple, nourishing meals he cooked himself or ate cold, and shelter. In return, he seemed to expect nothing beyond a quiet presence. They were given chores, cleaning, simple cooking, mending or tasks they performed diligently, grateful for the structure and purpose it provided after the aimlessness of their abandonment. Alara found herself watching him constantly. His routines, his interactions with his ranch hands, few and as taciturn as he, the way he handled his cattle. He was a man of immense capability, rooted in the harsh realities of the land. Her initial fear of him had completely faded, replaced by a complex mix of gratitude, curiosity, and a growing, hesitant respect. Maeve and Cora remained withdrawn, their spirits more deeply scarred by their past. But Alara found a strange sense of calm settling within her. The constant fear of death, of starvation, had receded. Here there was safety, however provisional. Her worth, she had been taught, was tied to her ability to bear children. To be barren was to be worthless, discarded. That belief had been ingrained so deeply, it felt like a physical part of her. But here, Silas didn't look at her as a potential mother. He looked at her as a person. He saw her quiet determination in performing the chores, her steady gaze when she spoke the few words necessary. He saw her, not her perceived failing. It was a subtle, revolutionary shift. One evening, sitting by the fire as the temperature dropped, Silas was reading a book, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. Alara was mending a tear in her dress. The silence was comfortable, companionable. He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "You read?" he asked, his voice soft. Alara nodded, surprised he'd asked. Reading was a luxury her previous life had afforded her. He didn't offer her his book, didn't make a grand gesture. But the question itself felt significant. An acknowledgement of her mind, not just her hands or her body. Slowly, cautiously, their interactions became more than just basic necessities. He would sometimes ask her a question about her day, or comment on the weather or the state of the ranch. Small, ordinary conversations that built a fragile bridge across the chasm of their disparate lives. Alara found herself looking forward to these moments, cherishing the quiet exchange. She learned that he was a man of few words because he saw no need for excess. He meant what he said, and his actions always followed. He was honorable in his own rugged way. She saw the loneliness in him too, a deep-seated solitude that even his wealth and land couldn't fill. He was the millionaire cowboy, yet he seemed as isolated as they were, albeit by choice and circumstance rather than cruel abandonment. A strange, unspoken connection began to form between them, woven from shared silence, mutual observation, and the unique circumstances that had brought them together. It wasn't the passionate connection of songs and stories, but something quieter, more profound, a recognition of kindred spirits in a vast, indifferent world. Yet, the precariousness of their situation remained. They were three women with no past acknowledged, living on the land of a powerful, solitary man. Whispers could travel across the plains. Their former husband's reach might extend even this far. The fear was always there, a low hum beneath the surface of their newfound safety. Alara knew this fragile peace couldn't last forever. Something had to break. Either they would have to leave, venturing back into a world that had discarded them, or their presence here would inevitably draw unwanted attention. And Silas, by sheltering them, was placing himself in a position of potential conflict. He hadn't asked about their former life, their husband. He seemed to respect their silence. But Alara felt a growing need to speak, not just for herself, but for Maeve and Cora, to explain their circumstances, to lay bare the shame, and perhaps, just perhaps, to see if the quiet respect she saw in Silas's eyes could withstand the truth of their being deemed barren. It was a terrifying prospect, risking the fragile sanctuary he had provided. But remaining silent felt increasingly like living a lie within the truth he seemed to embody. The land, his home, his quiet strength, it demanded honesty. And so did the fragile connection that was blossoming between them, like a desert flower pushing through cracked earth. The knock came at sundown, sharp, authoritative, alien to the quiet rhythms of Silas's ranch. 3 riders, silhouetted against the setting sun, standing by the fence line. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's newfound calm. They were here, men sent by their former husband. Silas stepped onto the porch, his posture instantly shifting from relaxed solitude to watchful defense. He didn't carry a rifle, but his stillness was weapon enough. The leader of the riders, a harsh-faced man in ill-fitting city clothes, spoke, his voice carrying across the yard, sharp and demanding. "We're looking for 3 women." Runaways. Alara felt Maeve whimper behind her, Cora stiffening beside her. This was it, the confrontation they had dreaded. Silas didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the men, his gaze steady and assessing. Alara stepped forward, out of the shadows of the house, standing beside Silas. Maeve and Cora, hesitant but resolute, followed her lead. They stood together, 3 women and the silent rancher, facing the threat. "They ain't runaways," Silas said, his voice low, carrying a deceptive calm that was far more menacing than any shout. "They're under my roof," the leader sneered. "They were the property of Mr. Abernathy, his barren wives. He sent us to retrieve them." The word barren hung in the air, heavy with contempt and dismissal. Alara felt the familiar shame rise, but this time, something else rose with it. Anger, resilience. She met the harsh man's gaze directly. "We are not property," she stated, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We were cast aside." Abandoned. Silas placed a hand, light but firm, on Alara's back. It was a gesture of support, of quiet protection, that spoke volumes. His blue eyes were like chips of ice, fixed on the riders. "You heard the lady," he said, his voice dropping another octave. "They made their choice. They ain't going back. Not with you." The leader scoffed. "Blackwood, you know the law. A man's wives are his concern. Especially when they carry his mark," he gestured crudely. "And these are useless goods anyway." Silas's hand tightened slightly on Alara's back. "The law out here is mine," he stated, his gaze unwavering. "And I say they stay." The tension was palpable. The riders were armed, but Silas Blackwood's reputation preceded him. He wasn't just wealthy, he was formidable. The leader hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of confronting Silas on his own territory against his orders. Alara stood tall, drawing strength from Silas's quiet presence beside her and the solidarity of Maeve and Cora. She was not useless. She was not property. She was a woman who had endured, who had found her voice in the wilderness. After a long, tense silence, the leader spat on the ground. "Abernathy won't forget this, Blackwood," he snarled. "You're harboring runaways. There'll be consequences." Silas didn't flinch. "Consequences are for those who trespass on my land with ill intent," he replied calmly. The riders exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, with another glare at the women and Silas, they turned their horses and rode away, swallowed by the deepening twilight. The immediate threat was gone. The silence that fell was different this time. Not empty, but charged with unspoken emotions. Alara turned to Silas, her heart still pounding. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Silas looked at her, his eyes soft now, the ice melting away. He didn't say anything, just looked at her with an intensity that stole her breath. He had called her the lady. He had stood between them and the past that sought to reclaim them. He had accepted them, flaws and all, demanding nothing in return. In his eyes, she saw not pity, not ownership, but a deep, quiet respect. And something more. Something that mirrored the hesitant warmth that had bloomed in her own chest towards this solitary, steadfast man. Her barrenness, the mark of her worthlessness in the world she had left, held no power here. Silas saw her resilience, her spirit, the quiet strength she had discovered under his watchful eye. He saw her as a whole person, not defined by her ability to bear children. The following days were different. The confrontation had cleared the air, forcing unspoken things into the light. Silas didn't retreat into silence. He spoke to Alara more, asking about her thoughts, her feelings. He didn't pry about her past, but allowed her to share what she wished. He listened, truly listened, and in listening, he showed her that her voice, her thoughts, her experiences held value. Maeve and Cora began to find their footing too, seeing Alara's strength and Silas's quiet acceptance as a path forward. Their future remained uncertain. The threat from Abernathy lingered, and their place in the world was still undefined. But they were no longer alone. They were no longer defined by what they lacked. One evening, standing together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast, dark sky, Silas spoke, his voice a low murmur that blended with the night sounds. "You found strength here, Alara. Strength you already had, I reckon. Just needed room to breathe." Alara looked up at him. "You gave us that room," she said. He was silent for a moment, then turned to face her fully. He reached out gently and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was warm, careful. "Maybe we gave each other room," he said, his blue eyes holding hers. The world outside was still harsh, society still judgmental. But here, on Silas Blackwood's land, under his quiet protection, and within the fragile bond they had forged, Alara knew she had found more than just shelter. She had found her own worth, independent of any man's decree or any societal expectation. She was not barren. She was simply Alara, a woman who had survived the storm and found a quiet, unexpected haven in the heart of the wilderness, with a man who saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. The future was uncertain, but facing it with Silas, with her newfound strength, felt less like a burden and more like a journey she was ready to begin.